What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 40 week 2 wide receiver rankings, also splitting these guys up into different tiers. If you missed my top 40 running backs, that video is already posted. You can check that one out after this one. But we're focusing on the wide receivers here. Any fantasy questions, drop them down below. But let's just dive right into tier 1. These are going to be my top 7 wide receivers. I wouldn't overreact to the order. You know, in your normal size leagues, obviously you're going to be playing all these dudes. We have CeeDee Lamb, Cooper Kupp, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase, AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, and Justin Jefferson. I do just want to talk about Cooper Kupp here. I feel like he has true wide receiver 1 overall upside rest of season. He's almost in the same situation that Puka Nacua was in last year, where Puka was balling out the first 4 weeks of the season with Cooper Kupp on IR. You know, once Cooper Kupp came back, Puka Nacua still kind of retained that wide receiver 1 role. I feel like now this year, Cooper Kupp is going to dominate for at least the next 4 weeks. And then even with Puka back, he's going to have the inside shot to be the top dog rest of season. So I really think if you drafted him as a fringe wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2, he is going to pay off massively for you rest of season. Also think this is a decent matchup here against the Cardinals. Amon-Ra St. Brown had a down week 1. I have literally zero concern about him rest of season. He's a great player. He's been a super reliable option. I think it was just one bad game. Jamar Chase, I think, also has wide receiver 1 overall upside. I know he didn't do a ton in week 1, but he was sick. Also had been holding out for a while. So my concern with Jamar Chase is also very low. I don't think anyone's debating that guys like AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, Justin Jefferson should not be in this tier. So those are going to be my tier 1 options. I will just say there are a couple players that I don't think are going to play this week that I won't have in these rankings. We have T. Higgins, who is still missing practice with that hamstring injury. And even if he does play, I'd be pretty hesitant to play him because we've seen over the last couple of years, there have been multiple instances where T. Higgins is going into a game questionable. They end up having him active, and then he just plays 2 or 3 snaps and is a complete zero in your fantasy lineup. So I would have to be getting some pretty positive reports about him to really even want to consider him in my fantasy lineup. And then the other guy who I don't think is going to play is Rome Odunze. Not that he'd be a super interesting option anyway, but could potentially help DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. And then obviously Puka Nacua not playing, who I just mentioned, with Cooper Kupp. But now looking at tier 2, we have 4 players here: Deebo Samuel, Rashee Rice, Nico Collins, and Mike Evans. I don't think CMC is going to play this week, and we've seen that when CMC misses time, Deebo Samuel is going to step in and pretty much be like a wide receiver and a running back. Even though he didn't do a ton on the ground last week, he still got some opportunities. He's going to have that rushing floor built in, and then also is going to be, at worst, their number 2 or 3 pass catcher. So I like Deebo here as a wide receiver 1. Then I have Rashee Rice. I think especially early on in the season, he's going to be an awesome option. I think he's much more safe than Xavier Worthy because he has more of a volume floor, also has touchdown upside on this Chiefs offense. So really like Rashee Rice here. Then we have Nico Collins. I think he's proven he's the clear wide receiver 1 here, ahead of Stephon Diggs, ahead of Tank Dell. He's in there on 2 wide receiver sets, coming off a great year, and has that chemistry with CJ Stroud. So I like him as a top 10 player. And then we have Mike Evans. I think he has a decent matchup here against the Lions, coming off a very impressive week 1. Looks like the Bucs are going to continue rolling here in 2024. Then looking at tier 3, starting off this tier with Devonta Smith, I just feel like he's a very safe, reliable option. Doesn't have the craziest ceiling if AJ Brown's healthy, but still a very solid play. Then we have Malik Neighbors, who is dealing with a knee injury. Might seem high for a rookie, especially considering the fact that he didn't completely dominate in week 1, but I really like this matchup here against the Commanders. Last week we saw Mike Evans and Chris Godwin both have big games. I think this could be a monster breakout game for Malik Neighbors, assuming he is healthy for this one. Then we have Brandon Ayuk. Didn't have a great week 1. Wasn't really involved in training camp. Might have taken him a week to kind of settle in here. But I do think if CMC misses, that is a plus to Brandon Ayuk. Because if Deebo is getting some snaps in the backfield, I think that's just going to open up more opportunities for Brandon Ayuk. Should have probably had a touchdown in week 1. I know he talked about how he should have caught it. I think Ayuk will be fine moving forward. Obviously a very talented player. Then I have Chris Olave coming off a not so great week 1. But I talked about this in my time to panic video. I really have no concerns with Chris Olave moving forward. Even though he didn't play well in week 1, didn't have the production, the fact that the Saints offense looked really good, I think is a great sign. It's not a great matchup here against the Cowboys, so maybe they get sent back down to earth, but I still think he's a solid play here as a wide receiver 2. And then the final guy in this tier, Devontae Adams. Didn't have a great week one. It's not a great matchup, but I do think it's going to be a pass-heavy game script, so I think he'll be fine here. Looking at tier 4, starting off with Stephon Diggs. Coming off a pretty big week one, I have some concerns. He wasn't used a ton down the field, but on a good offense, he's clearly still a solid player. I think he's a nice mid-tier wide receiver too. Not the best matchup against the Bears, but I just feel like this Texans offense is going to continue to roll. Then we have Chris Godwin, like I talked about with Evans. Think it's a decent matchup. Both these guys played really well in week one. We have Marvin Harrison Jr. and I guess Drake London, DJ Moore, these three guys back to back to back who did not have very strong week ones. For Marvin Harrison Jr., I'm not freaking out. It was his first NFL game. I believe in the talent. I believe in Kyler Murray. I think he'll bounce back. Have him ranked a little bit lower than where I had him ranked, coming into the year, but I still think he's fine in your lineups. Then we have Drake London, and I also talked about him in my Time to Panic video, and I'm really not concerned about him as a player. It's just the quarterback situation. You would really like to see Kirk Cousins go out and play better, but I think long-term, if Kirk doesn't turn it around, you at least do have Michael Penix there who could step in, but hopefully we get a bounce back here out of Drake London. Then we have DJ Moore. I do think the Bears offense is going to turn it around. I don't know if we see a complete 180 here in week two. Not a great matchup against the Texans, big stage, Sunday Night Football. I still think Moore is a solid back-end wide receiver too, but I think better games are going to be ahead in the future. And then the final guy in this tier is Tank Dell. I know he did not perform up to the same level as Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs, but the volume was there. He was tied for the team lead in targets with Nico Collins. He was actually right in line with those other two in terms of their routes run, which is something I really wasn't expecting, at least early on in the season. So I think that's a good sign for Tank Dell. It's tough for all three of these dudes to have big games, all at once. So there are going to be certain situations where maybe it's Tank Dell and Nico Collins who have big games, and Stephon Diggs is the odd man out. It's going to happen week by week. I'm not freaking out because he was the odd one out in week one. Now, pivoting over to tier 5, 4 players in this tier. I have DK Metcalf, Xavier Worthy, Zay Flowers, and Brian Thomas Jr. So we have DK and then 3 younger wide receivers. Metcalf's coming off a kind of disappointing week one. Tyler Lockett was really the only playable pass catcher there for the Seahawks. I do just want to see a little bit more out of the Seahawks offense. It wasn't a great passing game with the new coaching staff. I think they'll be fine, but it's also not a great matchup here against the Patriots. I still view Metcalf as their wide receiver 1, so I think him as like a back-end wide receiver 2 play is a fair spot to have him. Then I have Xavier Worthy, and I will say that I am very, very high on Xavier Worthy. I think I had him ranked as high as pretty much anyone I've seen in terms of like the fantasy football community, so I was super in on him. I think I have him on like over 50% of my rosters, but I do think some people are getting a little bit ahead of themselves when it comes to like him in the short term and his short-term production. I know he went out week one, had great production, had a long touchdown reception, also had a rushing touchdown, but I do think early on in the season, his floor is fairly low because he hasn't proven he's going to be like a super high volume target earner, especially early on in the season. So his weekly ceiling is undeniable. He's super explosive. He can make huge plays. And obviously I'm still very cool with playing him. I'm going to play him in most of my leagues as my wide receiver 24, but I wouldn't necessarily be throwing him in here over like super established options who maybe didn't have the best week one. So still really like Xavier Worthy, but I just want to be a little bit cautious with him in the short term until he, racks up some high volume target games. We're going to have Zay Flowers, who I think just kind of settles in here as like a fringe wide receiver 2. I don't think it's a great matchup against the Raiders just based on the potential game script. Like I feel like this could be a Derrick Henry game where they're going ahead early. The passing volume's pretty low, a lot of rushing volume, but he should be their wide receiver 1. Obviously their top, wide receiver option. I'm at number 1 target. So I think he's a solid play here in tier 5. And then we have rookie Brian Thomas Jr. I was very high on Brian Thomas Jr. heading into this year, and I felt great with what I saw in week one. I think he went like 4 for 40 something and a touchdown, but he was matched up on Jalen Ramsey, also drew a deep pass interference. So he looked like their top target that week. The fact that he did that against a proven, legit high-quality corner, I think is a great sign. The connection between him and Trevor Lawrence on that touchdown pass was wild. So I'm very optimistic about Brian Thomas Jr. moving forward. I will say for this specific week, the Browns matchup isn't great. If this was a much more friendly matchup, I could argue him, probably up into tier 4. But hopefully he goes out, just has another nice week here in week 2. Then looking at tier 6, I'm going to have 4 guys in this tier also. We have Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen, Michael Pittman Jr., and Terry McLaurin. I guess this is kind of like the veteran tier of players who underperformed in week 1. For Amari Cooper, I do have real concerns about his quarterback play with Deshaun Watson. I think some people are more optimistic than me. I'm pretty low on Deshaun Watson, but I still think the volume is going to be there. I don't think this is like a super scary matchup against the Jaguars. Like Jalen Waddle, Tyreek Hill had solid games in week one. So Amari Cooper, I think he's a higher end wide receiver 3. The talent's obviously there. It's just the Deshaun Watson situation that makes me a little bit uneasy. Then with Keenan Allen, he's dealing with a heel injury, probably not going to be 100% for this game, but I do think he plays. I think Rome Odunze being out could definitely help him. And Keenan Allen actually was like a couple plays away from having a pretty big week one. Caleb missed him deep on what would have been like a big reception. And then he also dropped like a pretty clean touchdown pass from Caleb Williams. So those two plays go differently. You know, he makes a play, Caleb makes a play. He's actually looking at a pretty solid fantasy day, so not going to totally tank him. I was probably lower on Keenan Allen than most, so maybe this still feels low, but I feel like this is a fair spot to have him. Then I've got Michael Pittman going up against the Packers here. I've been low on Pittman pretty much all offseason. I don't think he's a great fit for Anthony Richardson, but I do still think he's the Colts' top weapon here. So mid-tier wide receiver 3 is probably about where I'm going to settle moving forward. And then the final guy here, Terry McLaurin. In underwhelming week one, I'm not feeling great about Terry for the rest of the season, but I do think this is a pretty solid matchup here against the Giants. I would not be shocked if he had a nice bounce back game here. Now looking at tier 7, interesting tier here, some younger options, some interesting, matchups here. Starting off with Jameson Williams, coming off a very impressive week one, definitely seemed like a real breakout performance from him. First 2 years, hadn't done a ton, kind of been big player bust, had some volume in week one. It was fun to see. I also think this is a pretty nice matchup here against this Bucs defense. I think the secondary was already questionable. They're dealing with some injuries. I just think there are real concerns on what his consistency is going to be. Like I could definitely see J-Mo being someone where 1 week he's 5 for 100 with a deep touchdown, and then the next week he's like 1 for 20, and then you're playing him and it's not feeling great. So before I really skyrocket him up these rankings, I would like to see a little bit more consistency, but this definitely is a matchup, a spot where I do think he could have a nice, back-to-back performance here in week 2. Then I have George Pickens, might seem low as the clear Steelers top weapon. It's just this matchup could draw the Pat Surtain matchup, which would be kind of rough. I still think he's going to be their top target earner. Justin Fields, say what you want about him. He fed DJ Moore last year. He was looking to feed George Pickens in week one. I think he'll get his opportunities, but he could get a tough draw here with his matchup. Then we have Jaden Reed going up against the Colts. This may seem low to some people after his massive week one. And if Jordan Love was healthy, if I thought Jordan Love was going to play, Reed would be ranked much higher. I just think this could be a really tough week if Malik Willis is at quarterback. I am kind of assuming that Love is going to miss this game. And the thing about Jaden Reed is that he's a fun option, especially if the team's going well scoring, but he's not a dude who has a super high floor. So with all these weapons, if you're not, banking on the touchdown, it's kind of tough to see Jaden Reed commanding a ton of volume, being a super safe option. I still think they'll get him involved on the ground. He'll have a couple carries. But with Malik Willis, I do think that there are some, legit concerns there. Then we have Ladd McConkey going up against the Panthers. I think this is an interesting spot because I do think the Chargers are going to put up points, but how pass heavy are they going to be? It seems like they're kind of gearing into the run game, which was somewhat expected. Obviously, they're going to need to pass more in trailing game scripts. I just don't think this is the spot. McConkey had a pretty solid week one. I feel like you should feel optimistic about him moving forward, but I just don't know if this is the optimal spot here in week 2. And then the final guy in this tier, Courtland Sutton, commanded a lot of volume in week 1. I feel like Bo Nix should just continue to get more comfortable, continue to get better moving forward. And Courtland Sutton is just their clear-cut wide receiver 1 in a very, very weak wide receiver room. Now, the final tier here going to be tier 8. This is pretty much like our higher-end wide receiver 4s. I'll start off here with Christian Kirk. I've been pretty low on Christian Kirk throughout this offseason, much lower than consensus. I will say his usage was a little bit better than I thought it was going to be. He was at least splitting snaps in 2 wide receiver sets, whereas in the preseason, week 1 of last year when Zay Jones was healthy, he was just the clear-cut wide receiver 3, but he was splitting those 12 personnel snaps with Brian Thomas Jr., who I do think is just the better player and will continue to improve on his role. Gabe Davis was actually locked in, leading the team in routes here. So I'm going to be lower on Kirk. It's also just a tough matchup here against the Browns. And with all these dudes healthy, Brian Thomas Jr., Gabe Davis, Evan Ingram in the mix, it's tough for Christian Kirk to rack up a ton of volume, which is kind of where he gets his production from. Then I'm going to have Brandon Cooks. I think he's definitely a more appealing option if Jake Ferguson misses this game, but you could definitely be looking at, the number 2 option on a Dak Prescott-led offense. Then we have Deontay Johnson, and I'm pretty low on this Panthers offense, especially like in the short term, but I still think they could potentially have a little bit of a bounce back. Deontay should be their highest earning target guy moving forward. We saw Adam Thielen be relevant last year in what should be a worse offense. They should have at least some improvements here early on in the season. So Deontay Johnson, don't love him in my lineup, but I guess he's fine. Then we have Calvin Ridley, should be the wide receiver one for the Titans, but just draws a really tough matchup here against the Jets. Will Levis did not look great against the Bears, so I think, reason for hesitancy there. And then the final guy here, Jackson Smith-Njigba. If you wanted this to be Tyler Lockett, I get it. He had the better game, but we did see JSN have a better route participation. I'm not taking a ton from that week 1 game. Like, I still think DK is the number one. I'd still be leaning with JSN over Tyler Lockett, but who knows? I guess we'll see what the usage looks like. But that's tier 8, and that's going to wrap it up for my top 40 wide receiver rankings. Let me know your thoughts, any questions. Feel free to drop them down below. I'll make sure to get back to you as soon as I can. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.